Hello folks, it's Matthew Flanigan here with Wargamer.com. I'm going to be looking at Combat Mission Fortress Italy in this after-action report, if you will. Actually, this is the first battle in the American campaign. There are four campaigns, one of which is a tutorial, one is an advanced tutorial, one American, one German, and actually one Italian. I'm sorry, so 5 total campaigns in this game. This is the American one. Focuses around the attack on Trona, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is kind of taking place toward the tail end of the Sicilian campaign. Here we're looking at the briefing. Basically, it's giving me an overview of the campaign and then giving me an overview of this battle. This particular battle is taking place around noon on the 31st of July, 1943. I'm going to command a company of infantry with some support units. There's a platoon of tanks that are supporting me, as well as some mortars from, I believe, the battalion, which are supporting. We're attacking the left portion of the line, as you see on this map up here, which is Hill 234. It's actually a screening force for the Germans. So essentially this is the preliminary to our attacks on the German lines in front of Trona. This German screening force essentially is in position to allow the Germans to move around as they need to without being sighted by us. If we knock their screen out, it'll prevent major movements from their forces because they'll be exposed and they won't have essentially anyone in front of them keeping their movements secret. So here we go into the map. Looks like a very large force. It's 4 platoons of infantry. My objective here, it's a very hilly terrain, as you can tell here. It's pretty much straight uphill. It's not a mountain, but it's pretty much straight uphill here. Got a fair amount of vehicle support. Moving down that road would be pretty suicidal. I've got objectives on the left. There was that objective kind of in the center here on the North Pass. And then objectives on the center right, that's Hill 234, which is the primary objective. And then there's some ruins over there, which are a secondary objective. So my goal here is going to be kind of a double envelopment of the enemy. I'm going to try and push up the north ridge on the left, push up toward the ruins up there on the right, take both flanks, and then slowly work my way toward the middle, which is the peak of the hill, and then that kind of the north face, which is that valley or the descent from the hill, which I'm guessing will be harder to hit. Moving up the center, and I mean there's literally no terrain, no cover if you look down that road. So moving up the left, I should be able to use the terrain to get pretty close to that north or the ridge on the left, and then using the tree cover on the right, I should be able to get in around the right fairly well protected without taking too many casualties. Setting up the preliminary bombardment here. I always like to launch a bombardment early in any scenario in combat mission. One, because you get that free instant artillery coming in because it's a pre-planned attack. And 2, because typically the enemy's going to have some troops positioned on the objectives or in the objectives. And the pre-planned artillery strikes also give you a benefit of being able to target anywhere on the map that you want, because essentially it's more or less looking at a map geographically and calling in a strike, whereas during the middle of a battle you have to be calling an artillery strike down on something that you have line of sight on, because you don't know, essentially it's hard to call in artillery and spot for artillery if you can't see what you're shooting at as far as like a forward observer. But in the first preliminary bombardment, it's more or less just attacking map grids, which when you don't have troops anywhere near, as you wouldn't at the beginning of a battle, is more easily doable. So there's my artillery strikes. I want to go toward the top of 1204. I'm assuming there are going to be some enemy anti-tank weapons up there. It's the very top of the hill. It's got the best line of sight of anywhere on the map. Probably can see me. Not worried about the north face. It's kind of on the rear facing of a ridge, so I'm not worried so much about there. But the ridge line on the left and then Hill 204 kind of in the center right is what I'm going to be aiming at. No point in attacking the ruins in the fort in the woods because, well, It's just a secondary objective, and I can probably use the woods to gain cover and not have to worry so much about the enemy attacks. I'm also going to launch a mortar attack here. Let's see, let's use some of these 60mm mortars. The 60mm mortars are actually on map. I don't find myself using them too much, but there's probably... I'm going to guess there's an enemy anti-tank gun somewhere near that kind of north pass up top on that hill. There's some cover there. There's got to be some bad guys up there. It just seemed logical. Either that or the bush line a little bit further down the hill. But anyway, I'm going to move one platoon up to try and take the north ridge. I'll move a machine gun unit up there as well. I'll move one platoon up toward the right.
Check fire, check fire, check fire.
And that way I've got a double envelopment with one platoon going right, one platoon going left, and then I've got at least one platoon in reserve. And actually, instead of bombarding the top of 234, let's go ahead and lay a smoke screen. I can put a smoke screen down here. An early battle smoke screen should do a good job of covering my movement up the hill toward the left and covering my movement across the right in case they can see me. I don't think the terrain will let them see me till I'm kind of last minute there, but I'd rather not have to deal with enfilade fire coming in from the flank until I'm up in the objective point. I can use mortar rounds to launch a minor bombardment and still hit the top of 234, or sorry, 1234.
Quest fire, over.
Kind of keep their heads pinned. I might as well use all the firepower that I have in this scenario, being the Americans, and in this campaign really the Americans had an abundance of firepower to use, especially by this point in the campaign. This is actually about three weeks in to the actual campaign on Sicily. We're at the end of July, early August. The initial landings occurred on the 10th of July, so we're 3 weeks in, although at this point, the lines have kind of stagnated a bit. The center of the German line is actually based on Tronia, and I could be butchering that pronunciation, but essentially we're attacking the center of the German lines here. I believe it's called the Etna line. They kind of tried to set up a defensive line here. Didn't hold out for very long, only about a week and a half. It doesn't help that with control of the sea, the Americans could bring in troops to the rear of the Germans here. But Sicily really is an interesting campaign for me as I get these men moving up the hill. There should be good cover, so they should be alright. And I'll send see in a moment, but I'll decide to send in an Armory 1 tank as well. I've got 5 tanks. Send one in on each flank, so there's some armor support. I'll send a machine gun up there too, so some more heavy fire support. But Sicily interests me the most, I would say, of any of the World War II campaigns, at least the European campaigns. It's kind of a unique situation where, especially early in the campaign, it's a very unique situation where you see a fairly equal engagement. The Americans and Germans actually had very similar casualties. Now that can kind of hide the Axis casualties a bit because there were far more Italians engaged than there were Germans. But still, they had fairly even casualties. It was a very rough fight, especially the first couple of days. The Allies landed at near a town named Gela. The Big Red 1 went in the 1st Division. And, the attack was really in doubt for the first 2 days or so. The Germans launched a couple of fierce counterattacks, which are represented in this game. There's a scenario where you are the Germans launching the counterattacks against the beachheads, and that takes place on the first 2-3 days of the battle. The Hermann Goering division launched some fierce counterattacks. Sicily really interests me though, because for the first couple of days you really see some very heavy German air attacks come in, because the invasion of Sicily is pretty far off the North African coast, which the Americans had just finished taking. at the time of Operation Husky, which was the conquest of Sicily. And you see the Allies landing on the island of Sicily. It's the I believe it was the only major amphibious operation to be undertaken without aircraft carrier support. I'm not sure if D-Day had aircraft carriers, but England was so close to the French coast. I don't think that situation was really, important. Whereas Sicily is, several hundred miles away, and the Allied aircraft that were flying in support of the operation were actually operating at their maximum range. So you actually see a fairly even fight early in the battle. On the first 2 days, the Germans sank several ships. They even blew up a ship carrying ammunition. And it was really somewhat in doubt. The Americans couldn't keep a large enough combat air patrol over their ships to keep them safe, and it wasn't until the Allies started taking airfields on the island of Sicily that they could really change the tide of battle. What really stood out in Sicily was the effectiveness of naval gunfire, and you'd see it in later campaigns in Italy, and then also in the early campaigns in Normandy. But the actual effect that naval gunfire had on the counterattacks, I mean, the Germans, the first couple of days, July 9th is when everything started. July 12th or 10th was the date that the actual landings occurred. The daytime landings, anyway. The Germans went ahead and counterattacked, and it was very fierce. And it was on those early days. It was actually on the 10th that the landings occurred. And then basically up until the 12th, the Germans were counterattacking very heavily. And at one point, according to a few sources I read, at one point the Germans had actually pushed back, and you see some of those heavy 105s come in. At one point, the Germans had actually pushed the Americans back to only a couple thousand yards from the beachhead. The Americans were really in danger of being thrown back, and if it wasn't for naval gunfire support, you really could have seen a massive failure. Now, obviously, the gunfire support was there, and you could say it was never in doubt because of that, but it was really, I guess, it's not an operation that I knew a whole lot about, to be honest, before kind of studying this a bit more, and it was something that just really impressive. I mean, the U.S. cruiser Savannah, USS Savannah, really saved, possibly, it and a couple of destroyers saved the beachheads from German counterattacks. And it's just one of those things that you don't really think about how close Sicily was. There really wasn't, I mean, at points on other Italian campaigns, there were dangers of the Germans throwing the Allies back into the sea, but it even makes me question kind of Rommel's strategy of meeting them on the beaches for Normandy. I definitely think it's true that you have to stop, at least in World War II, the Germans' best chance, which they never did, the Germans' best chance at stopping an American or British or Anglo assault, naval assault, was on the beaches, but it really would have had to have been done by the landing force. By the time any kind of beachhead is established, it's too late to launch counterattacks because of the massive naval supremacy that the Allies had. I mean, there was no German force. No matter how many aircraft they brought in, they weren't going to drive off a fleet of hundreds of ships. They just weren't. And the Germans, no matter how many men it seemed like they could pour into counterattacks, aren't going to overrun beachheads when hundreds of 6-inch shells are flying in every couple of seconds. So I just think that's one of those things that is kind of lost in the shuffle as far as World War II is concerned. Sicily seems to be that operation that was lost in the shuffle. No one really talks about it a whole lot. Italy gets a lot of coverage for Anzio, Salerno before that, but Anzio specifically. France gets a ton of coverage because of D-Day or the Normandy landings. And the Pacific has a whole bunch of landings, but Sicily was really a major operation that in my opinion anyway, didn't really get covered to the extent which you would expect something of such a large scale to get covered. Actually, there's a really interesting scenario. I was considering putting my video up of it, where you play the role of a U.S. infantry. I think you only have about a company, and there's a battalion of Italian infantry coming at you, something like 500 infantry, and you've got about a 60-man team that has to hold off those 500. But what you do have is an artillery spotter with a whole lot of artillery to call in, most notably the USS Savannah, and it just kind of shows the effectiveness that huge naval guns could have. I did put together a video. I may put something together of that later as far as that scenario is concerned. I did pick this one because this is kind of a combined operations map, whereas that one is literally you just kind of play the role of an artillery spotter as you kind of call in artillery as the Italians get closer and closer. But you don't have any real vehicles to speak of, and there's really no room for maneuver because if you attack, you're going to get slaughtered. In this one, there's a fair amount of operational command. You need to attack with the infantry. You have artillery support. You've got armor. And I just think being on the attack is a better look at this type of game. So I've moved this platoon up here. I'm going to move one of my squads up around the left of the ridge, maybe to come in on the German flank. Hopefully to outflank. I'm assuming it looks like there's a German unit up here on the left. Take those out and then have some flanking fire into any German troops in that northern ridge section here. While I move these guys a little bit closer. I want to get this machine gun a chance. I just kind of want to get an idea of what he can see, what he can shoot at. What's in his line of sight. I don't see a line of sight button, which I do kind of miss. It shows you on the targeting line, what's in your line of sight and what's not, if you want to target something. But I really kind of wish they had, back in the old combat mission games, you could hit the button L and you could just kind of drag your mouse around and it would tell you everything you could see. You can still do that with target, but it's just a little bit more of a hassle. I guess I don't like that style as much, but it's just a minor quibble. Moving slowly. This is a 2-hour-long battle. There's no rush. In 10 minutes I'm up a couple yards away from that first objective on the left, so I don't want to charge in. You can really get yourself killed really easily in this game. If you just charge forward across open ground, you're going to get mowed down. So there's really no sense in rushing. Using the terrain is critical. I'm trying to do that. That's why I didn't move these guys up any further forward. I just want to kind of creep low toward the corner of the map. Create as much separation between me and the Germans as possible until I get into these woods so I have some cover to launch my attack from. I'm also hoping that the Germans have some weapons pointed toward the open areas that are kind of at the fringe of the woods so I can come in behind them, but we'll see if that ends up coming to fruition. But yeah, I mean, Sicily to me is just one of those really interesting campaigns. Germans were pretty much at a disadvantage in any campaign during World War II, especially later in the war. That's a broad exaggeration, but especially once America comes into the war, any Allied offensive, Germany was pretty much always at a disadvantage. So it's very interesting for me personally to look at Sicily, because it just, to me, it's such a even fight. And Italy as a whole, Italy's kind of like the forgotten war in World War II. Like I said, there's a fair amount of coverage for Anzio, but it seems like the rest of the Italian campaign is just kind of ignored, and that's one reason I really like this game, is it just kind of focuses on something that wouldn't normally get a whole lot of focus. I personally, knew of the Husky campaign, or the Sicily campaign when I was growing up because I played Panzer General. And it was one of the scenarios as the Germans, one of the starting points for one of the campaigns was the Operation Husky. but I guess I never really paid a whole lot of attention to it. Here I'm going to try and use the machine gun, the machine gun to pin down those Germans here, catch them in kind of a crossfire. But it's one of those things I didn't know a whole lot about. There we go, got one of them. You see that little red cross means that they are killed. One thing is, if you do launch covering fire or area fire, you do have to cancel the shooting. But yeah, I didn't know a whole lot about it. I did a fair amount of reading for the operation for this game, and just really fascinated me, to be frank and honest. There's a lot that really went on in World War II that doesn't get a whole lot of press. I mean, you look at Normandy, the Allies had so many ships, so much gunfire, so many aircraft. I mean, by that point, the Luftwaffe was basically ineffective, at least in France. You look at Italy even, by the time of the Italian operations, the Allies had that massive airfield in Sicily. Essentially was just a big airfield, and they had a lot of air support. Anzio was a little bit more exposed. It was kind of up there, kind of on its own. By those later points, the German Luftwaffe was largely gone, at least as a counterweight. In this particular campaign, early in the battle, as I already mentioned, the Germans had more men, more aircraft anyway, constantly operating than the Allies did. And it's just one of those rare times where you see American troops under constant air fire, and by this point, by 43, things are changing. Germany is not the dominant power anymore. They're no longer having those advantages of being an attacking force with superior numbers. And I guess that's why it's so interesting to me, because you look at the air war in Sicily, and at least early in the battle, it was the first couple of days, it was clearly in the Germans' favor. You look at the ground situation, being the defenders against an amphibious assault, clearly in the Germans' favor. The terrain was pretty neutral, I would say. It's in Sicily anyway. And the only advantage the Allies really had was naval warships. And they really turned the tide. If the Allies didn't have naval gunfire, Sicily would have been a bloody failure. And you see a lot of other things getting tested out in Sicily. Sicily was a testing ground for a lot of things that would end up coming in those later naval operations. It was a lot like Tarawa in the Pacific, or Guadalcanal in the Pacific, where you had that early campaign, you learned a lot of lessons, made a lot of mistakes, a lot of people died, and you kind of learned from it. And Sicily's the same way. I mean, the Americans used paratroopers in Sicily, but boy did those pan out poorly. Or not pan out at all, for that matter. I mean, you had aircraft getting shot at by your own ships, you had troops being scattered all over. It was just a nightmare. I mean, it was somewhat effective, but it was just, there was a lot that could have been learned there. And it just, I guess for that reason, it's just such an interesting campaign to read and study about. One thing I do like, and you'll notice this in this game, American squads tend to be pretty large, tend to be 9 to 12 men. German squads tend to be smaller, somewhere between 6 to 9 men. I don't know if that's by design or if that's due to there being casualties by this point. As you see, enemy artillery is decimating that squad of mine. It's lost well over half of its strength. But it certainly makes attacking as Americans when you've got multiple heavy weapons, as well as probably the best semi-automatic weapon in the game on your side. The American units are using the M1 Garand, which has the iconic ping when it runs out of ammo. It has an 8-round stripper clip that you put in the top. When you push it all the way down, the bolt action closes automatically. There's a, it was famously called the, you could have Garand thumb, which is, the M1 Garand, and then you could suffer from Garand thumb, which is basically, you push the clip down, you don't watch the bolt can close on your finger and kind of get your finger caught in there. It can really hurt. Having loaded an M1 several times, I would not want to be caught. I mean, it's a bolt action slamming shut on your thumb. I don't think it would cut your thumb off, but it would certainly bruise it pretty badly. So the Americans have that M1 Garand, which fires 1 round every time you pull the trigger. You don't need to work the bolt. It throws a stripper clip in there. You compare that with what the British were using, and the British had a bolt-action rifle. Probably the best bolt-action rifle ever made, but still a bolt-action rifle, where every shot you take, you have to work the bolt action and then, pull the trigger again. The Germans at this point have a bolt-action rifle as well. It's a Mauser. That you have to work the bolt every time you pull the trigger. The Italians have a bolt-action rifle. The Russians have a bolt-action rifle. The Japanese have a bolt-action rifle. Everyone is using bolt-action rifles, at least till later in the war. The Germans do develop a semi-automatic weapon later in the war. The Gewehr 43, I believe it was, which is actually a pretty good weapon, but never really was the primary service arm. So being the Americans in this game is pretty fun because you get the best rifle for your infantrymen. You get a great, essentially, machine gun that your men carry around, a Browning automatic weapon. It's a 30-round, fully automatic, 30 caliber machine gun, essentially, that I believe there's about 2 per squad. And then some of your men also get Thompson submachine guns, which is a very good submachine gun as well. The German submachine gun, I mean the Thompson and the MP40, the Germans used the MP40. I would say those are fairly comparable, but the Germans really didn't have anything comparable to the Browning automatic rifle till late in the war. So they were clearly outgunned on kind of the light machine gun support, outgunned on the rifle support. There's a lot of advantages to being the Americans in the game, as well as what the Americans had, obviously, in the war. Troops up here, getting hit as I move into position pretty badly. I got one squad really cut up. They're running away for dear life. Got a tank moving in. Hopefully I don't see any anti-tank guns. American tanks are very vulnerable to anti-tank guns, so gotta be very careful in this game. Your armor is very useful in this game, especially these M5s, because they actually have canister rounds. Similar to what a lot of U.S. tanks are using or were using in Iraq, essentially turning the gun into a giant smooth bore cannon, kind of Civil War style almost, which is great against infantry if you can close. But, jeez, is that artillery? I thought I called artillery in another part of the battlefield. Oh, I guess that helps. One other thing you'll see in this game is if you call artillery fire in where there's trees, it'll slowly beat the trees down and knock the trees down, which is kind of cool. An area will go from being forested to being open. Kind of makes you think about World War I, where entire areas that used to have trees and forests ended up desolate as like the moon. One thing I don't quite understand is it seems like when you do order a general artillery strike, sometimes when you call in artillery you get the choice of calling in either general or anti-personal. Anti-personal will focus more on air bursts. General will focus more on ground explosions and a mix of shells. I don't understand why smoke rounds come in with it. I wonder, it may be a spotting tactic where it's easier to spot for your artillery if you're calling in smoke as well. I'm not really 100% sure on that one, but you see kind of in there. Some of it's just smoke that's kicked up by the ground. In this game you will see, ground debris, ground smoke get kicked up. But some of it's white, which would be, smoke rounds. This tank up here, hope to clear some of the infantry out. I get caught into a trap where I tend to kind of focus on one thing, focus on the tanks, move them up, get them involved, and then I end up kind of being like a tank driver where I just command one tank to go around here, go around there. I get it caught too far forward without infantry support, and then it goes and gets itself destroyed. Infantry support is vital for the survival of a tank. If you get it in too close, your tank is going to get destroyed. They don't chew up regular infantry, but a lot of infantry have anti-tank weapons. You'll see the American squads have bazookas built into them. So you gotta be really careful. tank did a pretty good job of clearing out those foxholes over there. Bring up some infantry support. Move the tank over there. Alright. Fog of War, in my opinion, is handled pretty well as well. You kind of get a gray area where your men may think there's an enemy unit, but it's often off by a fair amount. One thing I do find... What the heck? That got destroyed and I have no idea where from. Wasn't from them. One thing I do think is difficult in the game is sometimes it's really hard to tell where fire is coming from. It's probably realistic, but it can be very frustrating. Well, the tank helped me clear the lower portion of these woods down, but if I'm going to advance up, I'm going to need more support than this. Especially now that I lost one of those 3 platoons, basically, of infantry. But I don't want to just send in tanks either. They'll get mowed down just like that last one did. I notice it doesn't seem like troops tend to be in their foxholes a whole lot. They tend to kind of lay next to them. I don't really understand that. I don't know if that's a graphics interface thing or if it's just the way the game's supposed to be, or if they're modeled as if they're in the foxholes, but the graphics just don't show them in there, but they still get the benefit of the foxholes. I'm not really sure. It seems like a lot of times troops are not in their foxholes, which to me seems pretty counterproductive. Let's check on over here toward the north ridge. That one platoon basically got wiped out trying to go up above and to the left of the ridge. Gonna see how many foxholes there. Some foxholes on the north ridge. And still got 3 men over there. Enemy artillery is what really did that squad in. They dropped artillery down. Tank up a bit. Maybe get a peek at the enemy over here. Just kind of see where they are. Maybe just pop my head out. Open up the turret. Stuart was an interesting tank. Very light, very fast, but almost a non-existent main gun. The American Sherman had an underpowered gun to begin with, a 75mm, versus the Germans typically used 76 high velocity versus the slow velocity 75, or the German 88. But the Sherman was even less gun. I think it was like a 40-something millimeter main gun. Wasn't going to penetrate any tanks, but it's a good infantry support tank, especially with that canister option. Literally, you can take out a squad in one cannon shot. Just shoots hundreds of little lead balls all over, like a giant shotgun. I'll call in some artillery support. It's about leveling part of that before I move the infantry in. Like I said, frontal assaults, you'll find in this game, frontal assaults are suicide. You always really want to try and call artillery to soften the enemy up. Another big advantage the Americans had was just ammunition quantity and artillery quantity. Remember in the original combat mission, at least the demo on the German battle for the demo just complained all throughout the briefing, as if the German soldiers were just complaining all throughout the briefing about American artillery. And it's really true. I mean, when you can call in that much artillery, I think artillery importance was overstated by commanders during World War I, may have been understated during World War II. especially with forward observers calling in close artillery fire. There's an enemy anti-tank gun. Gotta be careful with my vehicles there. Don't want to pop that tank up. I could probably take the North Ridge if it wasn't there. Those anti-tank guns will make mincemeat of our American tanks, especially the M5. Almost no armor. One hit and it's more or less done. Let's see what I can do as far as calling in artillery. I'll have good line of sight. I'm going to have to move that unit up a bit. You'll also notice in this game that artillery spotters are far more effective at calling on artillery than other units. Commanders of platoons and companies can send or can call artillery in as they have radios. Sometimes there are limitations with the type of artillery they can call in, but you'll notice that their spotting, to me anyway, tends to be far less effective. And you do have to be careful because friendly fire will destroy and kill some of your men if you call it in on the wrong spot.
Request fire mission over.
Alright, move that unit in there just to kind of get an eye on what's going on. One other thing that's difficult too is when you're selected on a unit, you'll only see what they see. When you unselect everything, you can see a combination of everything, but as far as enemy units, like those little gray squares, which are enemy units, you won't necessarily see everything that's out there.
Fire for effect.
Alright, so some artillery's coming in. Didn't see anything. Jumping forward a little bit. Right. Maybe we can move that unit over a bit, try and get up high. That unit is a bar, by the way. You can tell what type of weapon your infantry have as well if you look at the little silhouette kind of in the center of the screen there. Moving a little bit closer to kind of use them like a scout. And he's dead. We killed him. Sniper. I don't know if that little crosshair symbol on the far part of the screen symbolizes a sniper. I have one of my own. I don't know if that's what killed him. Could have been. Would have been a pretty darn long shot though. Let's see if we can poke up this tank and get a little eye on what's going on here. I don't want to get it shot though. I just want to kind of see what's there and then back up so I know how to better progress. Recon is very important. As you see, I'm kind of nudging around here on the left side to see what's up. I've got my troops there. There were 2 anti-tank guns. Quick reverse, back out of there before they get to me. Goodness, that was close. Darn, I can't get a shot off. But there's 1 anti-tank gun in the woods and 1 up top the hill. That kind of helps. So I've got those other units there on the right side of the screen that I can move in behind the anti-tank gun. That one on top of the ridge, though, is going to pose some problems. Artillery may be the solution. That unit can't call anything in. Certain types of units aren't allowed to call in artillery or air support. Others are. Artillery coming in. Should be mine, although the Germans have a fair amount of artillery in this game. What? Well, that artillery is way off target. This is an example of a platoon HQ or a lieutenant calling an artillery fire and being incredibly inaccurate with it. So then sometimes you just gotta cancel fire. It can take a while though from when you call in the artillery and when it actually starts falling. Just like canceling it if it's already got 8 rounds in the air. You might have 12 rounds in the air that haven't hit yet. So you could continue to see artillery rounds drop in for 5 to 20 seconds. I don't know if it simulates how far the artillery is from the front or not. That's kind of a neat little feature. Enemy sniper over there. Alright, I'm going to split this video into a second video. Just so we can kind of make things a little bit more viewable. So check out part 2 for the conclusion of of this scenario, and keep on watching and check out wargamer.com.